And there's a remark that I want to start with from book 2. Aristotle tells us, and this is Rackham's translation again, let it be granted to begin with, this is in chapter 2, that the whole theory of conduct is bound to be an outline only and not an exact system, in accordance with the rule we laid down at the beginning, this is in book 1, that philosophical theories must only be required to correspond to their subject matter, and matters of conduct and expediency have nothing fixed or invariable about them any more than do matters of health. Now, what is he saying there? He's telling us that ethics and other philosophical matters are not going to have the kind of cut and dried, it's either this way or this way, and we can be definitively sure about it in every single case and give, rules for it, as we might say for mathematics. We're dealing with particulars, we're dealing with things that are complicated, human nature is complicated. What we can do is provide, as he says, outlines, tupos in Greek, right? And so we have to, if you ever had one of those, coloring books as a kid, or now they have these adult coloring books for people with anxiety or things like that, you've got the outlines and then you have to put in the colors. That's the way it works with this sort of stuff. When it comes to virtue ethics, there are not a hard and fast, no exceptions set of rules that we can provide, and anybody who claims to provide those to you is not actually doing virtue ethics. They're doing something quite different. Does that mean that it's like anything goes? No, we can certainly have some guidance. Aristotle has some clear ideas about what a virtue looks like as opposed to vices, but we have to take responsibility for filling in the outlines. So that's quite important. Really key here, as we're going to see in other sections, is the mean, the middle. And Aristotle's basic idea is that things are made bad by too much or too little. It's often translated as excess or deficiency. We can say, well, too much or too little of what? Well, lots of different things, as we'll see. But, he uses the example of, for example, the body, eat too much, not good for you. Eat too little, not good for you. You want to be just right, in the Goldilocks sort of thing. If you're familiar with the Goldilocks story, she breaks into the bear's house. She's not a very good person, this Goldilocks, and she tastes some porridge. Some porridge is too hot. She takes a little bite and then leaves it alone. Some is too cold. Some is just right. Same thing with chairs. Same thing with beds, and all of these sorts of things. Well, virtue. This is kind of the Goldilocks thing is a silly, trivial story, but virtue is that middle section. So if you think about anger, for example, and this goes back to that question that Nicole was asking before about Stoics and Aristotelians. The Stoics said anger is always bad. Aristotle, who's predating the Stoics, by the way, says, no, you should get angry to the right amount at the right time. We can go on and on and on. And he also says this is difficult to do. By the way, if any of you are into, the whole emotional intelligence movement, Daniel Goleman begins his first book, Emotional Intelligence, with that quotation from Aristotle, where he is saying it's difficult to get angry to the right amount with the right person for the right time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So this is an important point. Things are made good by being in the middle. They're screwed up by going to excess or deficiency. He tells us in chapter 7 that the coward at one extreme, the rash at another extreme, and the courageous in the middle are concerned with the same matters or stuff, but they're differently disposed towards these. And what are these? So there's really two answers to this. Fearful things or situations, the stuff out there that we're actually feeling fear or confidence in relation to. So, if I'm afraid of spiders or bees or something like that, those are objects of fear, right? If I'm lying awake at night and not sure if I'm going to be able to, speak well at the conference that I'm going to, that's an object of fear as well, right? One is more imagined, one is right in front of me. And then there's the feelings that we have, right? So fear is something that we actually feel, and many of us feel it at specific parts of our body, right? Confidence is sort of the opposite or the converse of fear. You know what it's like when you go into a situation and you feel, a sense of like being, on top of things. And these two, are what courage and these other vices are concerned with. So where do we go wrong? He says error arises either from fearing what one ought not to fear, the wrong thing, right? Or from fearing in the wrong manner, fearing the wrong way, or at the wrong time. And then he's got, Aristotle loves these, hey, something like that, these sort of catch-alls, right? He says, and those other things, something of that sort. And then he says, similarly with respect to confidence. So, you remember back to right person, right amount, right time. These are all coming up in the virtuous mean and the vicious extremes. And so, what is temperance or what is moderation? So he says, an observation of the mean when it comes to pleasures. And he says that it's concerned in a lesser degree and not the same manner with pains. And we should also think here about desire, about appetite or epithumia in Greek, right? Desires for these pleasures. And he tells us that it's going to have to do with pleasures of the body, most specifically those of eating and drinking and sex, pleasures that we share with the lower non-rational animals. And this is where we're probably going to want to expand Aristotle's point of view a little bit. So he begins by distinguishing pleasures. This is in chapter 10 of book 3. And why is he doing this? He wants to help us zero in on what pleasures and what desires for those pleasures are really involved in temperance. He thinks that not all of them are. So he begins by talking about pleasures or desires of the soul. For example, philotimia, ambition, something we're going to look at later on in a couple weeks. Love of learning, philomatheia, right? Enjoy the sort of thing that's motivating all of you to be here right now. Loving to hear marvelous tales, right? Being entertained, right? I think watching things on Netflix would figure into this. Gossiping, talking about, what's going on with our neighbors. And he says temperance and self-indulgence, or prodigality is how the vice, akolastia, is often translated. Temperance and self-indulgence don't bear on these things. There's other things, other virtues or vices that have to do with those. Okay, so we've got pleasures of the mind over here, pleasures of the body. What about these pleasures of the body? Here's where Aristotle says stuff that we might not agree with. Temperance doesn't concern the pleasures of the eyes, although these can be enjoyed too much or too little or in the right manner. What's an example of the pleasures of the eyes? Looking at paintings. Again, watching shows on streaming platforms like Netflix or HBO Max or Amazon Prime, or pick whatever else you want. Sitting in the movie theater watching movies, right? It could be, looking at paintings or whatever else you want. So Aristotle says, okay, that's not temperance. What about hearing, listening to music, right? Or smell? He talks about loving the smell of roses or perfumes or savory dishes. In our time, we might think about people who have essential oils or buy candles, right, to make the air smell a certain way. Or, I made chili yesterday, and every time we walk into the apartment, you can smell the spices and the tomatoes and the beans and all that sort of stuff, right? there's pleasure involved in that, but that doesn't concern temperance. And so what does? Okay, we've eliminated 3 of the senses, right? Vision, hearing, smell. What do we got left? Taste and touch. So he even says taste plays a small part. And this is something that I just find incredible for him to say. But we'll look at the argument. He says, for the self indulgent, it's not the flavor of the food, but it's the touch that provides the pleasure, the filling yourself up with it, right? And we could think about this in terms of food. We could think about this in terms of, as he says, drink, which would include wine, which would include intoxication, or sex, right? And so the things that we actually do wind up being temperate or self-indulgent with are primarily pleasures of food, intoxication, or our sexual organs and activities and stuff like that. They all involve touch, according to him. So you notice that Aristotle discusses anger in the Nicomachean Ethics, in the passages that I pointed out to you. It's not a very long discussion, and you kind of wish that he'd written more. Same thing with the Eudamian Ethics, where he also discusses this, and Rhetoric Book 2, there's a big long discussion of anger and calmness, but it's from a different point of view. And there's no single place in Aristotle's works where there is the definitive position on anger. You kind of have to take, like a bit here and a bit here and a bit here and piece it all together. And that makes sense because Aristotle tells us in On the Soul, the De Anima, that anger, he uses this as an example, will be understood from different points of view. So, for example, the physikos, the natural philosopher, will understand anger primarily in bodily terms as boiling of blood around the heart, right? Because that's where Aristotle thought that thinking took place. A lot of ancients thought that. And they thought that the blood played a really central role in this, somatic function. So that's one way to look at it. Another way is what the dialecticos, the philosopher, the person investigating things psychologically, would say. And then he would define it in a different way as, a desire for retaliating, right? So there's different levels, you could say, or different ways of looking at anger. So in Rhetoric Book 2, Aristotle has a discussion of anger and of the emotion that's opposed to it, or the lack of anger, praotes, and he's using that word there not to denote the virtue, but just a condition, an emotional condition of calmness. And he defines anger there, and it's a very complicated definition. This is part of what makes Aristotle's work on this so attractive. So he says that anger is a desire, orexis in Greek. We just talked about that a little bit earlier, accompanied by pain, metalupes. Pain, and don't think physical pain, think psychological pain. Think disturbance, being upset. All right, so now we've got 2 parts of it. Desire accompanied by pain. What is the desire after? This goes to that question, does anger have an object? Yes, it has a very general object. Apparent retribution. Timorias phenomenes. Now, timorias is coming from the word for honor or social status. Timorias is sort of like a restoration of the social status that has been taken from one that was damaged, that was lowered in some respect. You set things right, that you rectify things. The phenomenes means apparent or imagined. This is very, very important. So people are looking, when they're angry, for something that we could translate as public retribution or imaginary retribution or apparent retribution, kind of in the middle, something that they can take as being retribution, even if the other person isn't. So you might have somebody who, tries to insult somebody else and they're not really insulted by it. And they do that because they're angry with the person. And the other person is like, whatever, dude, I don't care what you think. And that can be retribution for the first person who's like, I got you, man. I really zinged you. So, it really matters, this, you could say, subjectivity that's involved there. This isn't the whole thing, though. So we've got desire for retribution, apparent retribution, accompanied by pain. What causes it? Here he tells us in the definition: aroused by an apparent slighting. Once again, we see that word apparent in there, diaphainomenon oligorian. So slighting is, literally making something less, oligorian, treating it as lesser value. And again, we see it can be apparent. So you can get mad at me, even though I didn't do anything that should have made you mad, if you take me to be slighting you, to be treating you in a certain way. And there's one other part there's two other parts to this. So one part is the slighting is against oneself or those connected to oneself. So it could be your friends, it could be your family. As we're going to see, it could also be philosophy. It could be your sports team. It could be anybody that you think matters and you don't like people saying or doing bad things to them. And then the last part that's really important, the slighting being undeserved. To oligorein me prosecontos, it being unbefitting, not being how things ought to be. So, if you think that the slighting that you're getting is actually deserved, you don't get angry. You have to think that it is wrong in some sense. It's unjust. It's unfair. It's making, an exception for that person or making an exception of you. And there's one other part to it that's not in the definition, but I think is also an important moving part of this. There's pleasure in anger too. We've all felt this, I think, at one point. Aristotle says there's pleasure in taking retribution. So when you're actually doing the retribution, you're doing the action or statement or whatever it is, you feel good. You hang up the phone. Back in the old days, we used to have, phones that you could like slam the receiver down. Now, of course, all you can do is like, hit your phone hard to turn it off, right? I'm going to hang up on you, right? That feels good. There's a pleasure involved in that. Some people get pleasure in imagining or anticipating the revenge, the retaliation that they're going to take. And that might actually be something that they get, a little bit too involved in, and it promotes vice, right? So the mean, notice what the difficulties are. How one is angry, in Greek topos, the manner in which you're angry. So, let's pause on that for a minute. Actually, let's think about each of these in turn. When we talk about, in our contemporary parlance, the difference between expressing yourself and your emotions assertively and expressing them aggressively, that's part of that how, right? Getting angry at somebody. So, for example, we were at a concert just the other day, and it was an outdoor concert, and my wife was laying down. She had her head covered up so she could take a little nap because we got there, many hours ahead of time. It's Alpine Valley. It takes a long time to get in, get out. So we, rode a bus there, and there was a bunch of guys that were kind of talking together, and one was getting a little bit too close. And so I said to him, and I chose my terms quite carefully. I said, "Hey, kid, you're like one step away from kicking my wife in the head." And he like looked down and he got, apologetic and moved away. And I said it with kind of a sharpness to my tone. And I was kind of getting, who is this jackass who's like not paying attention to where he's actually walking? But, it was expressed in a way that was essentially assertive with an edge, not, hey, jackass, get the hell away from here, right? That would be, this is part of the how, right? You can express your anger within certain limits, we can say, certain rationally discovered limits. Um, so that's the how. With whom one is angry, in Greek tisi, the person that the anger is directed at. Oftentimes we get angry with the wrong person, right? If you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles or whatever it's called in your place, you can expect to wait in a line, and you can get angry about having to wait in a line. Why the hell don't they have more clerks up here to handle the stuff, right? And you get to the front and then you like blow up at the person. I can't believe I had to wait half an hour in line to deal with this. They don't control that. They're not the right person to get angry with. Or, the boss at the company enacts some new policy that's stupid and you blow up at your coworker. This is BS. They're not making the policy, right? They're not the ones that are threatening or slighting you in any way. So that's important too, right? On what grounds? Epipoios. What are you getting riled up about? What are you getting angry over? This is a big question too. There are some things that shouldn't make us angry, and then there are some things that should make us angry, right? And many people get confused about them. If somebody comes along, and I think that Iron Maiden is a great band, right? If you were to ask me when I was a kid, what's the best band in the world, I would have said Iron Maiden through most of my teenage years and then into my 20s. If somebody comes along and they're like, Iron Maiden sucks, should I be getting angry about that? Does that really make sense? Is that rational? That I let some Joe Blow off the street come along and spout some nonsense, probably not. That's a bad reason to get angry. How long? Once we are angry, how long do we remain angry? Do we let things go, or do we hold grudges forever until we get the retaliation that we want, right? Or the satisfaction, we sometimes say. Okay, that's a viable question. And then up to what point one is right or errs in being angry, Aristotle says at one point. There are some times when we shouldn't be angry, and then there's other times where we should. In this discussion first of generosity, he says that wealth or property, we have an observance of the mean, the mesotes, the middle position in relation to wealth. And here he says something really, really important. He says we call wealth all those things that we can measure monetarily. In Greek, heaxia, nomismati, metreta. So heaxia is the value of the thing, right? It's the worth of the thing. And nomismati is the dative of nomisma, money. And metreta, that's the word we get metrics from, right? To measure. So what can we measure? What falls within this scope? So we've got money itself, right? And I don't have my wallet here, but it doesn't matter anyway, because I don't have any dollar bills in my wallet because I don't carry cash anymore. Some of you may have seen videos of me, like when I would talk about this and I'd pull out a dollar bill or something when I was teaching at Marist College. Currency is a type of wealth. Property. This iPhone, I don't know what it's worth now. It's an iPhone 10. So, I mean, it was like $1,000 when we bought it. We measured that with money, right? I'm sure it's worth much less now. So its measure has gone down. This SIM card that I've got right here that I use for my video stuff, this water bottle, right? It's sort of like if you've ever seen the movie Dr. Detroit, which is a very trippy movie from the 1970s, a comedy. There's this scene where a person is having a terrible nightmare and there's somebody else who's acting in kind of a phantasmagoric, horrific way. And he's saying, all for sale, all for sale. Well, that means that it's being measured in money. And then, the terrible thing about that is he says, not my mother. And then he says, even your mother, so long as you can put a dollar amount on it, or whatever it's going to be, Swiss francs, euros, yen, it's got some monetary value. And if you think about our time, right? So we have money that you might have in the bank, your income, financial instruments and investments, our pensions, if we have them, or retirement accounts, which are, buying stocks and bonds and, things like that. These are all kind of imaginary, right? But they are things that we say have financial value. On the internet, people pay money for likes or subscribers or platforms or data, or people will even pay money for opportunities and experience. And in economics, they use this notion of willingness to pay. What would you pay to have a 1% less chance of getting sick? They send out questionnaires to people. All of this is stuff that Aristotle would say in our time can be measured monetarily. And I think that we could measure our time, and our energy and our thought and our attention in certain ways as well, right? Maybe not reliably, but it all falls within the scope of this. So let's talk about the virtuous mean. Virtue is always going to be a mean for Aristotle. What does this look like for generosity? And so he says that, again, this is kind of generic. It is observance of the mean with respect to giving and taking of wealth. So there's these two sides, right? But there's more to that. We could say the generous person gives on account of something, henika in Greek, right? And this is a term that I think you've heard me use before. Like if we go back to the very first session, the on account of, the motive, the reasoning. Why is the person giving? In order to accomplish something good, fine, noble, honorable. He also says that they give rightly, orthos, the word that we get, like orthogonal from, right? Straightly, in the right way. And there's gonna be a couple specifications to this, and we'll look at those in turn. So the generous person will be doing what? Giving. This shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. Giving to the right people, right? So the people that they should, the right amount. This is very, very important. You're not generous if you're like writing out checks for $1 million to everybody. That might be something different. It's probably going to be being a spendthrift or prodigal. You give at the right time. You don't have to give all the time, but there's certain situations that maybe demand it a little bit more. What else? The other conditions of right giving, as he says, kai ta'ala hosa hepatai te orthe dose. So orthe dose is right giving, and ta'ala is the others, and then hepatai means follows, those that follow upon right giving. So what would this extend to? Like, not just at the right time, not just the right amount, but in the right way. It's one thing if you give money to somebody and you do it and you're kind of snide and snarky and you're like, yeah, I hope you don't spend it on booze, you dirty degenerate. That's not being generous, right? To give that to, say, a homeless person. If you can give in such a way as to, not lower them in their eyes and your eyes, that probably would fall under there, I expect. Let's talk about magnificence. So we're shifting topic here slightly. We're kind of going upscale. This is a virtue that maybe not all of us can actually participate in and develop because we don't have the resources to do this. You could say, well, what about time? You can always give time. We all get the same 24 hours a day, and I use about 7 to 8 of mine in just sleeping, and then there's always like a couple I spend on screwing off, watching TV shows or stuff like that, so time can't produce magnificence, but wealth can. So Aristotle says in order for us to be magnificent, it's going to have to do with the spending of wealth on a larger scale. And the greatness of scale, he tells us, is relative. Think of it as like you can go past a certain threshold, and then there can be like lowercase m magnificence and uppercase m magnificence and in all capitals magnificence. And it really depends on the resources that you have and what you're doing with it. So he says that an outlay for outfitting a trireme or galley for the Navy is not great in comparison for equipping a state pilgrimage. A state pilgrimage is all these people going to a holy site, and I guess that's more expensive, like on a scale of magnitude, over equipping a trireme. We just kind of have to take Aristotle's word for granted for that. But we could think in our own time about like, my wife and I have looked at the idea of creating a scholarship at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, and you gotta come up with quite a bit of money for that, and that's a lot of money for us, but it would not be a lot of money for Jeff Bezos. He could basically sneeze and create, a million scholarships and he'd be just fine. Right. So there's different scales involved here. And he says that it's spending on great matters or things, and he also says something really interesting here. The magnificent person, in order to be magnificent, they have to be, the translation here in Rackham is they have to be an artist, but that's kind of a mistranslation. They have to be knowledgeable, epistemony. It's coming from the word for knowledge, episteme, right? They have to be knowledgeable in expenditure. And Aristotle gives us 2 criteria for it. He says that they have to be able to discern, literally see, theoresai, or like think of, what is appropriate, prepon. And this is where, megalo prepeia, this is where we're getting that from. The prepon is what is appropriate, what is befitting. And he also says they can spend great sums with good taste. In Greek, emelos, that's an adverb there. So, you all know people who spend lots of money, they proverbially make it rain, but it's not in good taste, right? They're doing it in ways that are demeaning to other people or show that they're just trying to be a big shot. That's not yet magnificence. So what else goes into this? He tells us that the object produced is, again, how to translate, or the deed, the doing, the ergon, must be worth the expenditure, the dapane, the money you're spending. And he uses that word axia there again. So we've got a value term. And then he says the expenditure must be worthy of or exceed the object itself. So the object has to be one that's worth spending money on. The money that you spend has to at least match or exceed the thing that you're trying to do. It's an interesting way to put it, I think. The next thing that he tells us is that the motive, the heneka, right, is doing something noble, doing something good. So, if I think about our own city right here, when I say we, my wife and I often go to the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, which is just several blocks from here. And we are really, really fortunate to have a wonderful symphony that has some stellar musicians, some of whom have been there for decades, a great composer and guest composer. We have amazing artists come in. We get to hear these world-class performances taking place just several blocks from us. And that exists because rich people spent money on it, right? We didn't, we buy tickets, but we're not like, shelling out, $1 million or something like that. Somebody did. And it's got, one of the most acoustically advanced music halls in there with all of this wonderful stuff. During the COVID pandemic, they were broadcasting live performances with all these mics everywhere and cameras and cool stuff like that. That is something noble. And you could say, well, wait a second, what if you're not into classical music? Well, it doesn't have to be noble for everybody. It doesn't have to be something that everybody gets into. I mean, you could also give money to children's drama performances, or to preserving the many wonderful parks that we're fortunate to have here in Milwaukee due to our socialist past. A lot of the Germans of 1848 brought their socialist ideas, like poor people should have access to nature, to this area, and as a result, we have much more green space than other cities our size. Um, all of that could be a matter of magnificence. All of that could be where the motive was the noble.